But what is disclosed to consciousness is still only absolute, that is, abstract spirit, which is this simple essence, not spirit as it is in its own self. In other words, it is only immediate spirit, the spirit of nature. Consequently, its self-conscious life is only the mystery of bread and wine, of Ceres and of Bacchus, not of the other, the strictly higher gods, whose individuality includes as an essential moment self-consciousness as such. Therefore, spirit has not yet sacrificed itself as self-conscious spirit to self-consciousness, and the mystery of bread and wine is not yet the mystery of flesh and blood. Paragraph 724 is a very short one, but there's an important transition, a realization taking place in it that we have been working up to. In previous paragraphs, I've brought up, well, why is it that Hegel is talking so much about Demeter or Ceres and Dionysus or Bacchus, depending on whether you're using the Greek or Latin names for them? And why is he talking so much about bread and wine and not quite as much about, say, animal sacrifices, which we had earlier in the discussion of the cult? And animals are connected up with the religions tied in with particular, we can call them ethnic gods, the gods of ethnoi, of Völker, of ethical peoples or nations. And here Hegel brings it out front and center. There is a, we might say, metaphysical or consciousness history-based answer to what we're asking here. And he says, what is disclosed, verraten, right? So disclosed here is translating what is in previous paragraphs for Miller been revealed or manifested, right? So the language is changing a little bit, but what is being revealed or disclosed to consciousness, Bewusstsein, is still, as he says, only absolute spirit. Now, that sounds pretty good, right? Absolute spirit, isn't that what the whole phenomenology is ultimately about? Well, at this point, no. At this point, we want something that isn't simply absolute, and Miller has this, abstract spirit. And you might say, well, wait a second. This whole section is the living work of art. We've already talked about the abstract work of art. Well, that doesn't mean that abstraction can't be still happening, right? So all of this stuff that we've sketched out that seems pretty concrete is still, by comparison, abstract or absolute, or as he's going to say in just a bit, simple, einfach, right? Einfach Wesen, simple essence or simple being, or immediate, unmittelbares Geist, right? Immediate spirit, which, whenever we have a lack of mediation, you might say, well, wait a second. We just spent the last couple paragraphs, actually not just the last couple, but this whole section showing all the mediations involved in the cult between the divine object, person, and the human worshiper, mediated through things like the bread and the wine, or the actions of the cult, or its hymns, or its language, right? Here Hegel wants to say, and this is where I think we have to keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak, right? We've got the spirit of nature, and nature for Hegel, as indeed we could say not just for Hegel, but for his successors as well, nature considered as such is counterposed to human culture, which transcends it, which includes not just what we would call anthropologically culture, but all the other aspects, law, religion, art, these things that we've been talking about here, history itself, right? Nature by itself is something less. And so the natural manifestations or disclosures, if we're going to use this word, in the mystery of the bread corresponding to ceres. Where do we get cereal from, right? Or you could say the grain, right? And then the wine, the fermented drink made, in this case, from the grapes, but could just as well be palm wine or beer or whatever we want, associated with Bacchus. It is religion. It is religion that is managing to bring together consciousness and self-consciousness, but it's not going quite far enough. And at a certain point in the development of things, Hegel says religion is going to grasp more. So he says its self-conscious life is only this mystery of bread and wine, not of the other. And here we're getting other gods getting brought in, right? Not the other strictly, eigentlich, higher, obere, gods, the other deities. And then here he says something very interesting. Gods whose individuality includes as an essential moment self-consciousness as such. So we've had self-consciousness on the part of the worshipper. We've had self-consciousness, you could say, on the part of the cult. We've had glimpses of self-consciousness in these gods represented in what is consumed, what is offered, what is given back and forth as gift. But it's not self-consciousness as such. Here, self-consciousness as such becomes, as he says, an essential moment, Wesentlich again, right? So we could move from Wesen to Wesentlich, of individuality. So the gods themselves possess, or could possess, or will possess, or should possess individuality. Very often, when we look at ancient Greek and Roman religion, and we typically, if we're being kind of sloppy and careless, just blur them together. Oh, there's Zeus and that's Jupiter, and there's Neptune and that's Poseidon, and Minerva over here on the Latin side, well, that's Athena. And obviously there's some differences. The Latin Minerva is a little bit more domesticated. The Greek Athena is a little bit more warlike. Things were way, way more complicated and took place through a kind of development. The gods becoming the gods of the pantheon is a historical achievement. And Hegel is tuned into that. Now, we should actually say we have several different kinds of gods here, one of which is actually not present, but we've talked about earlier in the phenomenology, and that would be the chthonic gods, the gods of the underworld, the gods of the family, the gods who, very often were engaged in apotreptic things just to try to keep them away and not fall afoul of them. The Olympian gods, and of course Ceres or Demeter and Dionysus wind up being part of that pantheon, but the Olympian gods are somewhat different. They're not simply nature gods. Think about what they represent. Ares, Athena, war in different aspects. Granted, you've got Poseidon as the sea, Hades. Is the underworld really part of nature? Well, I don't know. Zeus is kingship. Juno is, womanhood in many respects. The wife, the mother, also ruling over the pantheon. Zeus throws thunderbolts. That's natural, but is it purely natural? He's not just a thunder god, right? And we could go on and on. We don't have to belabor this point. But we're going to get something different here. And here it's interesting because Hegel brings up something that prefigures something later on. He says, the mystery of bread and wine is not yet the mystery of flesh and blood. What does that immediately bring to mind? Christianity, right? Now, later forms of Christianity after the Protestant Reformation tried to turn the idea of bread and wine becoming flesh and blood into something that's mere symbolism, right? Hegel's straddling that very time in which this is being bandied about and worked out. And he belongs to a religious denomination that, by the way, actually, at least at that time, held that it was still the body and blood, that just the Catholics had gotten that wrong. He was a Lutheran. But we can also think about this in terms of the ancient Greek gods or other pantheons as well. Flesh and blood. Whose flesh? Whose blood? Human beings' flesh and blood? Or that that of animals. Well, we're going to get to that. And what straddles all of this? A sacrifice of self-conscious spirit to self-consciousness. Self-conscious spirit, that of the God. Not just these gods, but rather these other gods, the higher gods, the fuller conception of God. Sacrificing itself to self-consciousness, the self-consciousness of the worshiper within the cult. This undisciplined revelry of the God must bring itself to rest as an object, and the enthusiasm which did not attain to consciousness must produce a work that confronts it, as in the previous case the statue confronts the artist, as a work, moreover, that is equally complete, but not, however, as an intrinsically lifeless, but as a living self. Such a cult is the festival which man celebrates in his own honor, though not yet imparting to that cult the significance of the absolute being. For it is essence that is manifest to him at first, not yet spirit, not as something that essentially takes on human form. But this cult lays the foundation for this revelation and unfolds its moments separately. Thus here we have the abstract moment of the living corporeality of essence, just as previously we had the unity of both in an unconscious revelry. Man thus puts himself in the place of the statue as the shape that has been raised and fashioned for perfectly free movement, just as the statue is perfectly free repose. Although each individual knows how to play the part of at least a torchbearer, one of them comes forward who is the patterned movement, the smooth elaboration and fluent energy of all the participants. He is an inspired and living work of art that matches strength with its beauty, and on him is bestowed as a reward for his strength the decoration with which the statue was honored, and the honor of being in place of the God in stone, the highest bodily representation among his people of their essence. Here in paragraph 725, I think you can finally say we're getting to the namesake of the entire subsection, the living work of art. And what is the living work of art going to consist in? Well, at least in this paragraph, it has to do with something bodily, something in which spirit can find at least a partial receptacle that wasn't adequately available to it before this. And it's not happening just in the community. For example, just a paragraph or two paragraphs before, with the crowd of frenzied females, the untamed revelry of nature in self-conscious form. No, now it's going to be an individual. And we saw that just in the last paragraph, the Olympian pantheonic gods, we could say, as opposed to the chthonic gods or the nature gods of the bread and the wine, or whatever else we're going to substitute in place of that, wind up being individuals. And that has to be stressed. Now, this paragraph is not going to give us everything that we need for the living work of art. That's going to happen in the next paragraph as we add another important layer to it, one that's, as you're going to see, familiar to you from the Hegel shtick of previous sections. But let's take this up. So he says, the undisciplined revelry of the God must bring itself to rest as an object. What undisciplined revelry of the God? Well, you might be tempted to think back to the previous thing, the untamed revelry of nature in self-conscious form, the crowd of females, but it could just as well be other worshipers. And Hegel here is going to talk about the festival taking place through the cult. And we saw in the previous subsection that this can involve all sorts of people, not just frenzied worshipers of Dionysus going around and doing their thing. And he says, the enthusiasm which did not attain to consciousness must produce a work that confronts it. We have this need for Gegenständlichkeit, objectivity, something that stands against you that you can use to grasp things. As he says, in the previous case, the statue confronts the artist. So where are we talking about there? The earlier section of religion, right? We finished nature religion by talking about the Werkmeister, the person who produces rather than merely the production, the person who produces something that could be an idol, that can be architecture, that can be a shrine, that allows a housing of the holy. And then we moved on to the religion of art, right, earlier, and we talked about that quite a bit. He says, as a work, however, that is equally complete, but not as an intrinsically lifeless. Right? A statue's intrinsically lifeless, right? However beautiful you might make it, whatever design features you might build into it, even if you turned it into like a robot, right, that every once in a while would say, Zeus is happy with you, or something like that, it's still intrinsically lifeless. It only has a facsimile of life, right, at best. Here, we want something that is genuinely living, a living self. And here's where he brings in the cult, right? He says, such a cult is the festival. And cults, they do a lot of different things, but festival is part of it. We've already seen this discussed before, right? We decorate the whole temple, and the god gets flowers or garments or whatever else put upon them. Maybe we lift the statue of the god up and we carry him around in a procession, right? And there's music and dancing and food and revelry and all that sort of stuff. That's great. That's part of a festival. But in this case, we have an important transition. A festival of what? A festival, now here, Miller uses the older term man, right? The festival which man celebrates in his own honor. Mensch. So this is like anthropos in Greek, right? It doesn't have to signify just man. It signifies humanity, whatever gender somebody might be. And this is a celebration of what it is that we are, what it is that the people celebrating it at the time are, how they understand humanity, which might include some pretty rigid gender roles, by the way, right? But that's part of their culture, their Bildung. So he says, the cult is the festival which man celebrates in his own honor, though not yet imparting to that cult the significance of the absolute being. Now, the cult is being talked about here as if the cult is what really matters, rather than just being a locus, a place where things are transforming. He goes on and he says, it is essence that is manifest to him at first, not yet spirit. Wesen, not yet Geist, right? Not as something that, here's a key thing, playing off of essence, essentially takes on human form. We could pause here and ask, well, what does the God look like? Or what do the gods look like? And one answer to it is the gods cannot be represented, right? And that's actually, in some respects, an ancient idea that we see arising, but it's also a very late modern idea as well, because we do represent not just, in terms of Vorstellung, but also Darstellung, placement. We place and space the gods. We could also say, well, the gods can be partially human, but partially animal, or the gods can be totally, foreign to us, like, 100-handed things like the Titans, or, giant tentacle monsters, or whatever we want it to be, some aliens. Or they can be like cartoon characters, or they can be superhumans, or they can be, if they're going to be our gods, they can be much more like us. And then we can relate to them in ways that are quite different than just some crazy monster. or animal totem, or pick whatever else you want. No, I mean, there's things that could be debated here. Maybe there's something that we learn by being associated with the bear or the caribou, or pick whatever else you want, and taking on certain features of the animal. But the human being has traditionally been understood, and not just in the Greek way of looking at things, but in other things, as sort of like the universal animal, like the Swiss Army knife. In some respects, right? Swiss Army knife does all sorts of tasks, none of them especially well. By the way, Aristotle actually talks about a tool like this way back in the Politics, which shows that this is not a modern thing. He criticizes barbarians for being a little bit too indiscriminate that way and not differentiating properly. All right, back to the text, right? So he says, essentially takes on human form. But this cult lays the foundation for this revelation, Offenbarung, right? A word that we've talked about before, where we're moving after this section of religion. The religion is a work of religion tied in with art, right? The art religion is going to be to the revealed religion, the religion of revelation. But we have revelation going on here as well. So he says, the cult lays the foundation of this revelation and unfolds its moments separately. So we've got the abstract moment of the living corporeality, the bodiliness of essence. Now, why bodiliness? Well, how the hell else are you going to have a living thing, right? Is it just going to be some, airy spirit that kind of floats around, Geist in the sense of like Casper the Friendly Ghost? No. I mean, we could have daimones like the ancient Greeks did that, are the interpreters between us and the gods that became so important in Neoplatonism. But here we have corporeality. Here we have bodiliness. We have something that is alive before us. He says, just as previously we had the unity of both of these moments in an unconscious revelry, and therefore human being puts themselves in place of the statue. What is the statue? The statue is perfectly free repose or rest, right? And the human being is placing him or herself in place of the statue, or alongside the statue. Maybe the statue sits there and now it's being upstaged by the human being. As the shape, the Gestalt, that has been raised and fashioned, worked upon, right? The term there for fashioned, ausarbeitet, worked out, worked through, erhoben, raised, lifted up, elevated. Raised in fashion for perfectly free movement, Bewegung. This is something important. The statue cannot move. We might also say, not only can the statue not move, which makes it a static thing, with which we may invest all of our affectivity and thoughts and narratives, that's true. The statue can actually do a lot if we're investing it through the cult. But when we have a living human being, not only can they move, they can react. They can use consciousness to decide what to do. They can use self-consciousness to relate to the audience, the community, the worshipers, and not just provide the same thing over and over and over again. We could say a similar thing, and I don't want to get too far ahead of us, about, say, film visual representations. There's a certain cannedness to any video performance that is missing an aspect of what a live performance looks like. Giving a talk over and over and over again as a video is not the same thing as being in a room with students or learners or fellow professionals and engaging with them on things. And we can say a similar thing about the living work of art here. So he says, although each individual knows how to play the part of at least a torchbearer. He's talking about the community, right? And this is a very important point to make. Let's not leave the community out. No community, no cult. This is not something you just, as a human being per se, retire into your room and say, I'm going to be my own religious object. Hegel would say, that's nonsense. That doesn't happen except for cranks. And even they need followers in order to make it work, effectively at all. And sometimes cranks do get followers. That's where we get a lot of cults from, right? The community of those who are at least torchbearers, at least committed, engaged participants within the drama of the festival. Then that's not to say that they can only be torchbearers. They can be more than that. They could be acolytes. They could be assistants. They could be the narrator. They could be all sorts of things. But they have to be at least torchbearers, not just slack-jawed watchers or something like that. So he says, one of them comes forward who is the patterned movement, the smooth elaboration and fluent energy of all the participants. Now notice what he says here. He is an inspired and living work of art that matches strength with its beauty. A very important phrase there. Inspired, right? So the God is involved here, and living work of art, section that we're talking about here, that matches strength with its beauty. And on him is bestowed as a reward for his strength a decoration with which the statue is honored. And the honor of being in place of the God in stone, he says, the highest bodily representation among his people of essence. What essence? The essence of the God? Well, yes, but their essence, the essence of the people. This is very humanocentric. The God matters. The God is something more. The God is something transcendent. But the God is so for the community and for the human being, and in particular for the one who is the highest bodily representation, the highest Leiblicher. Right? Leib is a body. Darstellung. Not Vorstellung, Darstellung. Being, presented there within the scope of the community for these people. That's what's going on here. And in the next paragraph, we're going to see another very important element being brought in.